This week we are looking at the devastation and disasters of the late Middle Ages. And so you see here a list of some of the problems. We had disease, war, rebellion, religious scandal, and an external threat. So the Black Plague is witnessed by a number of authors, chroniclers, poets, diarists, all sorts of people writing talk about the plague. And what they tell us is this: a disease came from the east. It comes from China. It comes with the merchant ships. And it brings swellings that appear in people's armpits and in their groin, spots that appear across the body. These swellings burst, and in 3 days you either died or you were going to survive the plague. There's another form of plague that's accompanied by a high fever and lots of coughing and spitting. And they see them as different but the same. They're not sure why the plague is happening. They're thinking maybe God is punishing them for sins. They think the air is bad. They think the water has been poisoned. They're just not sure. Okay? But they have very similar accounts. The other thing that the accounts tell us is that people began dying in such numbers that the system in place for death was overwhelmed. There weren't enough people to do burials. They start doing mass burials. They start doing layers of bodies in pits, and then they stop being able to bury people at all. Friends abandon friends, family members abandon family members, as people realize that being around someone who is ill can cause you to get ill. And people are really shocked by all of this. Okay. The medical profession is not really able to help with the plague. Medicine at the time involved praying, wearing amulets against illness, or being bled with either kind of making a cut in your arm and bleeding, or applying leeches and letting them bleed you. And what we see, in fact, is that as the plague goes on, doctors begin kind of trying different things. We would say experimenting. And eventually they're going to start looking inside human bodies. And this is going to help kick off, to some extent, what we start to call the scientific revolution, this questioning about why is this happening? How is the body working or not working that this is happening? Culturally, people are, as I said, very upset by all of this death. And one of the things that they realize is that death is inevitable. It's going to happen to everyone. You don't know when. And it happens to young, old, rich, poor, beautiful, ugly, everyone. And that when we die, we will all decay and we will all suffer rot, no matter how beautiful our faces or our clothing while we were alive. So you'll get this artistic motif of the dance of death, and you'll see the skeleton, like you see in this image, coming to drag people away. The other thing you'll see is this hourglass, which is a motif that shows up a lot. That all of our lives are an hourglass and the sands are running, and we don't know how fast and we don't know how much sand is left, but our time is limited. So you have this very poor family. You can tell they're poor. They live in a shack that has holes in the roof, and their child is being led away by death. And they look unhappy, but they also look like they don't feel like there's much they can do. These are two more images from the same series. So you have a very wealthy man whose death has come to meet, and he wants to ward death off. And then you have, again, another not very wealthy person, the peddler, a guy who carries his store on his back, goes from village to village selling miscellaneous goods, kind of like a medieval Walmart. He is not a rich man. He has holes in his shoes. He has a mangy dog. But even he does not want to go with death, and death is kind of pulling him forward. Then you have this very wealthy, kind of noble-looking couple courting. They're very into each other. He's looking longingly at her, and she's looking pretty pleased with herself. They're so into themselves and each other that they can't hear that death is in front of them, banging this drum. And again, the hourglass is there for them. Another place we see the impact of the plague is on funeral or mortuary effigies. So when medieval people were buried, if you were wealthy, you would have an effigy carved of yourself, and it would be put on top of your tomb. And this is an effigy of the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1327. So before the plague first hits Europe in 1348 is the first big wave. 1348 and 50 are the biggies, and it continues up through the 1600s, actually. So this is pre-plague, and here he is. He's got his bishop's robes on. He's looking like very bishoply. Okay. This is after the plague. Another Archbishop of Canterbury. This one is inside the church. Here he is, looking very grand in all of his bishop apparel. But what he's done is he's had carved his tomb, and he's had carved a version of himself in a state of decay. So this is not his actual body, but it's carved to look like it's his actual body. Then his body would be actually buried underneath the floor here. But this was, again, a reminder of death, that this is what he was going to look like when he died, even though he looked like this when he was alive and had all this power, that we would look all like this someday. So that was the plague. Another crisis was the 100 Years' War. And this was a war that lasted more than 100 years. It didn't go on continuously. There were periods of truce in this time frame. But the big players were France and England fighting each other. And they were fighting each other because France wanted England out of France. So the background is, from their last unit, you know that William the Conqueror had become the King of England as well as the Duke of Normandy, sort of tying part of France and England together. And then Henry II had brought the province of Anjou in, and then Aquitaine when he married Eleanor. And so had all this vast land in France as well as England. But his son John had lost much of that, and the French wanted to see England lose all of that. So the war itself is very complex, but in a grossly simplified version, England wins most of the battles. If you had made a bet at most points in the war and said England was going to win, you would have been looking pretty smart. But strangely enough, France wins fairly close to the end. And many historians talk about the role of Joan of Arc. She comes in and turns morale around. The French were feeling like God hated them, or at least wasn't on their side. But she comes and speaks for God. She is a mouthpiece for God, and the French say, oh no, maybe God is on our side, and they start to drive the English out. Both sides used mercenaries in a big way in this war, and this was very devastating to the French people, whose countryside was being ravaged, whether they were during a period of truce or not. And it was very difficult on the peoples of both France and England, as they had to pay high taxes in order to fund those mercenaries. So the impact of the war, England was mostly kicked out of France. They held the port city of Calais when it was all over. And national sentiment is on the rise by the time this is ended. The English king actually started speaking English because of the 100 Years' War. It was not appropriate anymore for a king of England to speak French. And the French started to get a sense of who they were as a people. So they were unified more than they were divided. Economically, France was devastated, thanks to the fact that the war was fought on their territory and that the mercenaries were running around all the time. And the English were heavily impacted because King Edward's Parliament that he had established, which was called to approve taxes, was called regularly during this entire century plus, so that they could get taxes to pay for the war. And they got so used to being called and meeting that when the war was over, they continued to expect that they would be called and consulted on governing the kingdom. It was an expectation. Also during this period, we had a couple of peasant rebellions, a big one in France and a big one in England. Why are the peasants rebelling? They're being taxed at a very high rate to pay for the war. And at least in the case of the French, they weren't winning. So they were trying to figure out, why are we paying all these taxes for these nobles to protect us when they're not doing a very good job? The Black Death was going on at the same time, intermittently as the 100 Years' War, and people were saying, it changed people's minds. They thought, life is short. We need to enjoy life while it's here. And they also started asking questions of authority in general. They were questioning the authority of the church. They started questioning the authority of the nobility. However, the peasants weren't Marxists or socialists of any kind. They just wanted their king to understand what they were going through. So they're not anarchists or really revolutionaries. They just want to change in the people around the king. The church was also undergoing a series of scandals. First, the Pope moves from Rome to Avignon. And then we have a couple of popes, and then 3 popes at one time. And there's more about this in the chapter, but the Avignon papacy, the Pope moves to Avignon because things were problematic in Rome. While he's there, he builds a brand new palace. You can see in this image. It's a big financial crisis. He doesn't have access to all of his funds that are in Rome. And he comes up with a new way to raise money. He pulls out the old indulgence from the Crusades and says, we can ask for cash for salvation and call it an indulgence. When the Pope finally moved back to Rome, he didn't live very long. He died, and a new Pope had to be chosen, and the College of Cardinals was split. And they ended up electing 2 popes. And in the process of trying to fix that and go back to 1 pope, they actually elected a 3rd pope. So there's an internal power struggle over the papacy, and it ends up making the papacy look like a complete joke. People lose faith in the office of the Pope. The Pope is revealed to be a political actor, just like any king. And we have a rise of a movement back to bishops in councils representing the faithful, called the conciliar movement, to resolve this. And we go back to saying the church is the people, not the church is the Pope. And this is going to cause some serious challenge to the social pyramid in Europe. Lastly, there's an external threat. The Ottoman Empire was growing in the east. And I'm not going to say much about the Ottomans themselves, just talk about them as they impact the West. So the West is once again faced by an external threat, which should have unified Europe, but it took Western Europe a while to catch on that this was their problem too. What it really did was it distracted Eastern European leaders, and the Holy Roman Emperor among them, from internal squabbles as they dealt with the threat from the East. And ultimately, this is going to end up bringing a renewed anti-Muslim sentiment to the West because of fear of being conquered and having their way of life completely changed. So you'll read more about all of these disasters in the chapter and get a little more detail.